Welcome, dear friends, to the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center Sunday morning program. Please note this program is being recorded and will be made available on the Nova Baha'i Center website, novabc.org. At this time, we invite everyone to turn on your cameras to create a friendly, welcoming atmosphere for meaningful conversation with our host speaker. To enable your cameras, please move your mouse to the lower part of your screen and click on the video camera icon. You've been muted at this time to reduce audio feedback, and unmuting will be enabled after the presentation so that you can ask your questions and participate in the conversation. We want to take a moment to thank the Sunday morning program team. And now we will begin with our devotional program.
O thou kind Lord, thou hast created all humanity from the same stock. Thou hast decreed that all shall belong to the same household. In thy holy presence, they're all thy servants, and all mankind are sheltered beneath thy tabernacle. All have gathered together at thy table of bounty, and all are illumined through the light of thy providence. O God, thou art kind to all. Thou hast provided for all, dost shelter all, conferrest life upon all. Thou hast endowed each and all with talents and faculties, and all are submerged in the ocean of thy mercy. O thou kind Lord, unite all. Let the religions agree and make the nations one, so that they may see each other as one family and the whole earth as one home. May they all live together in perfect harmony. O God, raise aloft the banner of the oneness of mankind. O God, establish the most great peace. Cement thou, O God, the hearts together. O thou kind Father God, gladden our hearts through the fragrance of thy love. Brighten our eyes through the light of thy guidance. Delight our ears with the melody of thy word, and shelter us all in the stronghold of thy providence. Thou art the mighty and powerful. Thou art the forgiving, who overlooketh the shortcomings of all mankind.
We are one, but we are different. we can succeed. We are one, but we are different. We from all around the world. We share the same sun, we share the same oceans. We are every boy and girl. Come together and share our dreams. We be amongst the stars, and we know that it's destiny that we are unity. No matter where you're from or who you are, if we can find common place to be, then we are friends. We are one, but we are different. We from all around the world. We share the same sun, we share the same oceans. Oh, we are one, but we are different. We from all around the world. We share the same sun, we share the same oceans. We are every boy and girl. Come together and share our dreams. We be amongst the stars, and we know that it's destiny that we are unity. We are unity.
Thank you so much for those beautiful devotions. Welcome everyone to the Sunday morning program. Just a reminder for those dialing in that this program is being recorded. For the dear friends who have participated in our programs in the past, as well as those who are joining for the first time today, we thank you for attending and encourage you to fully participate during the Q&A and discussion portions for a truly rich learning experience for all. Sometimes after the recording ends, at the end of the program, there is time for those who'd like to stay on and ask their questions. So do be mindful of that. Today's theme is the continuation of a series on the alchemy of peace, key mindsets and habits to achieving peace from a Baha'i perspective. It gives me great pleasure to introduce again Sovaida Ewing, who will be speaking on how we can overcome the scourge of nationalism, xenophobia, tribalism, and polarization using the Oneness Model. Sovaida Ewing is an author, speaker, international lawyer, life mastery coach, and founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, a virtual think tank and online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global challenges. Her latest book, available on Amazon, is The Alchemy of Peace: 6 Essential Shifts in Mindsets and Habits to Achieve World Peace. She also hosts a live video podcast called Reimagining Our World on Facebook and on the CPGG YouTube channel. It's dedicated to creating a vision of the world we want and infusing hope that we can make the choices necessary to attain it. Thus, without further ado, please allow me to welcome Sovaida to speak on how we can overcome the scourge of nationalism, xenophobia, tribalism, and polarization using this Oneness Model. Welcome, Sovaida.
Thank you. Thank you again, Farinaz, for that very gracious introduction. And welcome to all of you. Delighted to see you, at least see some of your faces, and I see the rest of your names here, but really wonderful to have the group. So I'm going to give a short presentation today, and then we'll engage in discussion. Last time we had a very robust conversation, give and take, and I know I learn a lot from all of you. So I want to not deprive myself of that. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get going. All right. So you may have noticed that each of our sessions builds on each other. So we started off explaining the importance of mindset. We explored what mindset means, how it's formed, why it's important. And you'll remember, for those of you who are here, that we concluded that even the smallest shifts in mindset can have a massive effect on where we end up, either in our individual lives or in our collective lives, which is more of what we're talking about here. So the importance of mindset in creating our reality. If we don't like the reality we're in, then we need to shift mindsets to create a new reality. We also talked about the fact that mindsets trigger and spawn habits. So by shifting mindsets, that's how you get to new reality. It's by doing that, you then create new behaviors that become habits that over time and geography become culture. And then last time, our second session, we talked about the importance of free will, the gift of volition that all human beings have been given. And we looked at concrete examples of the reality that we can always choose our reactions, and that where we are in life, collectively or individually, is just a snapshot in time and is not a determinant of where, or a predictor of where we're going to be in the future. And that therefore we have agency, and that any moment we can harness that gift of free will to make different choices in how we think, in other words, mindset, and in how we behave, which is essentially our habits. Now, and then we talked about the fact that this alchemy of peace method, this new kind of methodology that I've proposed in my latest book, The Alchemy of Peace, can be used in order to bring about far-reaching changes. And we said it was a 4-step process. Today, we're going to actually take that 4-step process and apply it, or see what happens when we apply it to dealing with and overcoming a cluster, if you like, of scourges that are really decimating the social fabric of our societies around the world, namely nationalism, xenophobia, tribalism, and polarization. And we're going to look at what the old mindsets are, what these old habits that have been spawned by the old mindset, then figuring out how to replace it, what is the new model, which is the oneness model. I'll unpack it for you, and then what kind of behaviors that model leads to. So let's get going. So step 1 of the Alchemy of Peace process applied here is to ask ourselves, what is the thinking that has caused us to engage in such virulent nationalism, tribalism, polarization, as we see in our country here in the United States, of our political parties, and xenophobia, this fear of immigrants and this backlash against anybody who is not like us, especially if they're quote unquote foreign, i.e. come from outside the country. So the dominant mindset that is the root of all these behaviors is this thought that globalization is to blame for many of our problems. So it's essentially grounded in fear that we're going to lose our national autonomy and become reliant on other states. Globalization, by definition, leads to interdependence and interconnectedness. And therefore, the corollary is that it decreases national independence. So we start to feel, for those of us who are fearful, that globalization is making us weaker as a nation. We blame globalization for a whole host of ills, such as cultural homogeneity. Oh my goodness, wherever you go in the world, you see Starbucks or McDonald's. This American culture is pervading the entire planet, and it's all uniform and boring. We also blame it for inequality. Increased international trade has created vast gaps in wealth, and multinational corporations operate with unregulated political power. We see all the stuff that's going on, with Facebook and Twitter and all of these platforms and various corporations that operate in multinational fashion around the world. We see it as a threat, globalization as a threat to our jobs and opportunities as citizens, as globalization has made it easier to travel and cross boundaries. And so people are flowing into our countries and, quote unquote, we believe, taking away the jobs that are rightfully ours. Globalization has made it easier to spread disease rapidly. We saw this with COVID and with the pandemic, right? It spread like wildfire, even though it started in China, in Wuhan. Environmental devastation caused by tourism, and on and on and on. Fundamentally, this old mindset that globalization is to blame for many of our problems is also coupled with another thought that groups of human beings, whether categorized by race, ethnicity, or national identity, are by definition at odds with each other. Now, what is the habit that comes as a result of this old mindset? Well, the solution to all these problems of homogeneity and our jobs being threatened and all of these problems we perceive is that, gosh, we've got to get back the power we've given away. What was that? Our power to determine our own fate as nations, national sovereignty, and to put our people and our nations first. And that's how you come up with slogans like America first, Hungary first, France first, China first, Russia first. And it's amazing how many, Turkey first, how many countries have lately in the last few years been engaging in this reversion almost to nationalism with saying, hey, we need to put our countries first. So because we believe that we need to get power back, we move to more insular practices that we think are going to gain us autonomy and independence. Now, one of the things we notice is that these habits of insularity tend to come in a cluster. And I find this fascinating, and I'll give you an analogy in a second so you understand my fascination with it. The cluster is isolationism, and I'm going to unpack each of those a little bit. Xenophobia, tribalism, and polarization, and the king of all of these, like the queen, if you like, or the king in the cluster is nationalism. Now, you can understand this phenomenon by thinking about the human body, and I have to be careful. I know we have at least one doctor in our midst, so I hope that I'm not way off base when I share my very limited understanding here. But when the immune system is taxed in a sustained manner over long periods of time, it can become reactive. And it's like you turn off an on switch and the body doesn't know when to stop. The immune system doesn't know when to stop being reactive. And indeed, it starts being reactive to the body itself. And we end up with what we call autoimmune diseases. Now, what's interesting to me about autoimmune diseases, and I've had reason to delve into this a little bit over the last few years, is that if you develop one autoimmune disease, apparently you have a far greater chance of developing one or more others. So let's say if you develop multiple sclerosis, you're far more likely to develop also rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Hashimoto's disease, fibromyalgia, etc. And vice versa. So it apparently this is true for all the others. So when I look at human society, this is to me a very helpful analogy. I think that over time, we have weakened the immune system of our global society with our very reactive habits. And as we have, as our immune system has weakened, we've now become susceptible to a whole range of autoimmune diseases where we literally attack ourselves. We are one body, and yet we engage in isolationism, xenophobia, hatred of people who are foreign or different from us, tribalism and polarization and nationalism. To me, all of these are symptoms of the same root cause, which is fragmentation, which is the opposite of unity. which is the opposite of integration. So that's my analogy for you on this front. I like analogies. They work for me because they create imagery that then helps me remember an idea. So I hope it works for you too.
Sovaida, June, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to know if you are aware that your screen is showing your entire presentation and not the slideshow version. And if that matters to you.
No, it doesn't matter to me. Are you able to see each slide as we go?
We can see each slide and also the slides on the left side, just as you see.
Okay. I thought I put it in presentation mode. You know what? Let me stop sharing and start sharing again, just so that we have, let me go into this and start it. Thanks for letting me know, Farinaz. I love technology. Okay, let's try this. Share screen, round 2. Okay, is that better?
It's perfect. Thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, no? Okay. All right. Now, let's examine each of these dysfunctional habits a bit more closely. So isolationism is really the act of remaining aloof from the affairs or interests of other groups, especially of other countries. So think about the Second World War, where, you know, Germany and the Axis countries are starting to take over Europe and you know, in the Far East and Africa. And Britain is desperately trying to get the United States to enter the war on its side so that they can defeat the Axis powers. The United States, meanwhile, is extremely isolationist. They're thinking, that's their business. We don't want to get involved. You know, we want to hunker down and focus on taking care of our own isolated interests. Now, this kind of behavior, and we'll see more of it, we'll unpack a little bit more, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding that particularly in times of difficulty, to save ourselves, we're better letting each group or nation handle their own problems. Like everybody just hunker down and deal with your own problem, and we're not going to either ask for assistance or give assistance to anybody else who needs it. Now, if we lived in a world that was self-sufficient and completely independent, this would make sense. But here we are, we live in a completely interdependent and interconnected world in which globalization is a reality. And so, you know, it just doesn't make sense to do that. Let's think about Syria. So when the civil war started in Syria, and when we first heard that the regime was using chemical weapons against its own people, what did the rest of the world do, especially the West? Our reaction was, it's their problem, let them deal with it, we're not going to interfere. So what was the result? 400,000 Syrians have died, 6.2 million internally displaced within their own country. Another 5.2 million are refugees in countries around them like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. And then they tried to go farther afield to Europe. Now, what effect did it have in Europe? It triggered huge xenophobia and nationalism in Europe. And we saw the rise of populist regimes in Europe really their primary attempt was to keep out the migrants coming from the Middle East and Africa. European countries started to close their borders, and we also started to see disunity within the EU, within the countries themselves. Another thing that happened in Syria was it created a fertile environment for the Islamic State to grow and to flourish. And remember the horrendous executions and that we saw and the terrorist acts. And the third thing that happened is it led to various countries backing different sides, factions within Syria, leading one newspaper article to describe at some point what was going on in Syria. We got to a really dangerous point where they described it as a proto-world war, because, you know, Russia and Turkey and the United States and Britain and France, everybody had taken sides, and they all had their troops and weaponry in that region kind of facing off against each other. So it was, it could easily have triggered into another world war. Now, the problem with isolationism is it leads to fragmentation. Because people then think we want to be independent, we want self-determination, so they try to break off from their larger nations. So, you know, the Brits exited from the European Union. The Scots want independence from Britain. The Catalans want independence from Spain. The people in the north of Italy want independence from Italy, on and on and on. We've seen this with Ethiopia and Eritrea. We've seen this with Sudan and South Sudan. We've seen this with Hong Kong, really not wanting to be part of China, and so on and so forth. And the Kurds, a quest for autonomy and independence. And it's, you know, you start breaking humanity up and soon you're going to revert back to tribalism. Okay, xenophobia. What is xenophobia? It grows out of a belief that the superficial differences between human beings is a reason to rank them as better or worse. So whether it's based on color or gender or based on where in the world people come from, it breeds suspicion, fear, and ignorance of the other, and breeds a mental construct that the other is always somebody or something separate from us. In other words, it completely disregards any notion or reality of the oneness of humanity. Now, what's interesting with xenophobia is that the emotions that underlie it are far more negatively charged than with isolationism. With isolationism, it's just kind of leave me alone, let me do my thing. With xenophobia, there's active hatred of the other, hatred, prejudice, and fear. So let's give a couple of examples of what xenophobia actually looks like today. So let's take Poland. So when we had all these migrants trying to come, especially from North Africa and the Middle East and Afghanistan into Europe, Poland was one of the countries that said, well, no, absolutely not. We close our borders. We're not accepting anyone because we're not taking migrants. Then later, people investigated and realized, oh, they were absolutely taking migrants. Not only were they taking in migrants, they were taking in large numbers, historically large numbers of migrants, but from where? From countries who had whose people had similar ethnic and religious backgrounds, like the Ukraine. So their goal was to maintain the purity, if you like, of their people and of their religion. So if you were white and if you were Christian, you were welcome. But if you were anything else, quote unquote, then this feeling of prejudice caused them to push people out. Italy was another country that really had trouble, didn't want to accept migrants, started to get scared. They opened their doors for a while, but realized that the number of migrants from North Africa were increasing. And so they started to worry that over time, if these people lived in their country and had children, that the mix of Italians would shift from what they knew to be Italians to kind of mixed race. So they did something really bizarre. What did they do? They basically ended up punishing women. Women always get to be the scapegoats. They told Italian women that we're going to make getting an abortion harder for you. And the reasoning was that if you can't have an abortion, then you're more likely to have more children who are going to be Italian. And so we can maintain our strength in numbers. Whereas if you have abortions and these immigrants have more children, then it's going to upset the balance in the country. I mean, when I read that, it was like, wow, yeah, go ahead, punish your own women and make life really difficult for them because you have this prejudice against other people. So let's look at tribalism and polarization. The idea is that of a team, that I belong to a team and my team is always right and my team always wins. So it's a sports type mentality. There's always a tinge of superiority. My team's better than any other, self-righteousness, entitlement, and the willingness to blame each other. And a hallmark is ever-present competition. So you're always in competition with someone. So So think about politics in this country. This is exactly where we are. Our political parties are really just sports teams. And you can see this because when you look at the things that they support or they're against, they don't actually align with the traditional ideologies of those very same parties. It's not about ideology anymore. It's simply about supporting your team. And whatever your team says is right, no matter how nonsensical and however much it actually opposes the ideology of that political party. We see, particularly post the 2016 election in the US, that the polarization in this country has increased. So, and we see that essentially it's a 50-50 split, give or take a couple of points, percentage points in this country. And we see how this behavior of polarization has weakened the immune system of our society, of American society, so that when COVID came along, we were ill-equipped and continue to be ill-equipped to tackle it effectively. And with climate change, we're similarly ill-equipped. We can't agree on a bill to pass in Congress that includes a component that ensures that we do our bit to tackle climate change, which is an absolutely existential problem that humanity is facing. Nationalism, the fourth of this cluster of societal diseases, is the most baneful. So what does nationalism mean? It means seeking to advance the interests of one nation, my own nation, particularly at the expense of others, in the mistaken belief that to survive and thrive, nations must be in constant competition with each other, with some winning and others losing. Contrast nationalism with what actually Shoghi Effendi, the second authorized interpreter of the Baha'i writings and head of the faith for a period, called a sane and intelligent patriotism, which is constructed. And what does that mean? It means it's a space in which we exert our energies toward advancing our nation in the fields of education, scientific discovery, music, arts. So we're contributing something positive as opposed to stepping on other countries in order to ensure that we're doing okay, which is nationalism. Now, examples of nationalistic behavior today. We all know about the fascist regimes in the 20th century, but what about today? You don't have to engage in fascism to be nationalistic. The quest to secure, for instance, access to water has led to nationalism. In Ethiopia, they started building a dam on the Blue Nile in 2011. And about 10 or 11 countries share the waters of the Nile. And so Sudan and Egypt, that are two of the countries that share the water, started to be very worried because if Ethiopia filled the dam too quickly, it was going to basically take away a portion of the water that Sudan and Egypt had traditionally had and that they desperately needed to survive. The only way to resolve this problem was through collaboration, cooperation, and consultation, but Ethiopia started filling the dam in last year in 2020, and it caused great consternation. And Sudan and Egypt even started saber rattling, saying, you know, if we have to, we'll go to war because our people need water. So that's an example of, if you like, resource nationalism. Another kind of a nationalism that we've seen, and by the way, nationalism is a really corrosive thing that affects our collective ability to address collective problems. We've seen this with COVID, right? What we call now vaccine nationalism. Each country trying to secure enough vaccines to vaccinate its own people, never mind whether people in other parts of the world get it, right? And in this country, of course, we're at the point where we're now even giving booster shots. We've guaranteed booster shots to every single person in this country, in addition to their original doses of shots, while the rest of the world is lagging far behind. Then the field of nuclear proliferation is another example where we see nationalism on display. So we have a global regime, supposedly, that's supposed to protect us against nuclear proliferation. But that global regime has been weakened because of nationalism. So countries didn't want to give away any portion of their national sovereignty, their rights to make their own decisions for their own good. So we have a regime in which countries can choose to sign on or not. When it's something this important to the safety of the planet, that we are constantly under the threat of a potential nuclear holocaust, we can't afford to have a global system that each nation can choose to sign on to or not. Then if you sign on, you can withdraw very easily with 2 months notice, and you don't really have to give much of an explanation. There's no proper way of verifying and monitoring whether nations are in breach of the rules against non-proliferation. And so we've seen a lot of breakouts with countries developing nuclear armaments, even though they've signed on to the treaty against nuclear proliferation. Climate change is another example of nationalism. So you're probably all aware that next month in November, representatives of nations and our leaders are going to be gathering in Glasgow for the 26th COP, the Conference of Parties, that's what it stands for, to once again consult on what are we going to do to arrest climate change and mitigate the effects that have already been started, but to keep global warming down to, remember, we were going to try and keep it down to 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. Well, we're already up to 1.1%. And all the experts say that even if we were to fulfill the pledges that nations made in Paris in 2015, remember that the last meeting where all these nations got together, they came up with what's called the Paris Agreement. And in it, the way they crafted it was crazy and a prime demonstration of nationalism. Countries didn't want to give up their rights to sign on to a binding document saying each country promises to cut emissions by a certain amount by a certain time. Instead, they said, let's just leave it to each nation to voluntarily give a pledge. So it was voluntary and it was a pledge. You know what pledges are like. One administration comes, they fulfill a pledge. The next administration comes, they don't, because it's not a legally binding rule. And that's exactly what happened with America as we moved from one administration to the next, and now back to an administration that believes in climate change and doing what we can. So we're in the game again. But this Paris Agreement was truly unfortunate in the sense that it's so weak. Even if all the nations who've made voluntary contributions actually fulfill their pledges, we are still not going to be able to keep global warming down to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial rates by 2100. In fact, the rate we're going, they're predicting the world, listen to this, will have warmed 4 degrees warmer. Already 2 degrees, they say, will be catastrophic, which is why we tried to keep it to 1.5. We're now set on the path for 4 degrees. So I hope to God that next month in Glasgow, we're going to have to turn on a dime and create an international system where we can create binding legislation. I just don't see any other way to adequately tackle this if we're not going to destroy large segments of the human race. As it is, every year we're destroying 1 million species. Climate change is destroying 1 million species. That's horrific. I mean, I don't know if your mind can wrap itself around this. Mine can't, you know. Can you even name 20 species, let alone think of 1 million, and then think that we've literally just destroyed all of them? Anyway, so what is the new mindset, step 3 in the alchemy of peace process, right? What is the new mindset that we need to replace the old in order to create a new reality? So the new mindset has to be based on an understanding that we can't blame globalization, because globalization just really means interconnectedness. There is a professor at, I think he's at Columbia, Jeff Sachs, whose life work has been on globalization. And he says, globalization is not something you can undo. It's a fact of life. And he says, it's something that started 70,000 years ago when modern humans first started migrating from Africa. As soon as you leave your nation, you start traveling, you start doing trade, you start communicating, you go back and forth, you bring diseases back and forth, you bring goods back and forth. That's globalization. And with time, it's just gotten more and more and more. And every time humanity has tried to take a few steps back in globalization, you know what the result has been? Militarism and fascism. So it just doesn't work. What we need to understand is that this interconnectedness and interdependence, which is the hallmark of globalization, while it has many benefits, simply has an underbelly. It has a weakness. And the underbelly is that because we're interconnected and become like a single human body, we're now subject to systemic risk. So if you get cancer in one part of the body, your whole system is going to be susceptible to that cancer. You can't isolate it. Sometimes you can, but often not. So we just need to get smarter about crafting ways of doing things that take into account that, hey, what I do in my country now affects what happens in other parts of the world. If I burn too many fossil fuels in this country, climate change is going to affect everyone everywhere. Now, the mindset we need to replace the old mindset is this new one that on the slide, that we've become a single organism prone to systemic risk. So think of the human body. This means understanding several things. The body is composed of different parts. Each part has its unique and valuable contribution to make. And it's only when all the systems and all the parts of the body are working efficiently and in coordination with each other that the body is able to perform at peak capacity. So the same is true with peoples, ethnicities, races, nations. Each of us has something unique and valuable to contribute. And it's only when we work in coordination and each of us is given the opportunity to flourish that humanity as a whole can operate at peak capacity. So the more we expose ourselves to diverse outlooks and ideas and understand that the more we have a clash of thoughts, the more we produce sparks of light that illuminate new approaches and solutions to our global challenges. So the hallmark has to be collective action, collaboration, and cooperation. An example is how scientists, and I raised this once before, I raise it again because to me it is, we need good role models. Our scientists during COVID were amazing role models. They collaborated across national boundaries in order to create not just one vaccine in record time, but a whole number of vaccines. They created some in Russia and China. We've got the 2 mRNA vaccines. We've got the Johnson & Johnson, the AstraZeneca. And they did it instead of taking 12 to 14 years, which is the average time to create and be able to distribute a vaccine. They did it in 11 months, which is historic, but shows what we can do when we put aside our egos and our isolationism and our nationalism and our hunkering down and saying, I want to wait until my paper's published because I want to get credit. You know, it's the individual equivalent of nationalism, if you like. It's an ism, it's egoism. So the other thing we need to realize is that there are certain laws that govern our social reality. This is again critical. Just as in the physical realm, there are physical laws that govern our reality, like the law of gravity. I can choose, I have free will choice. I can choose to ignore the law of gravity, but if I tried to build an airplane and ignored it, it wouldn't work. And in fact, would be dangerous. Yet we as human beings have blithely ignored the reality of the law of the oneness of human beings and have tried to build social institutions, political, economic, environmental institutions, and religious institutions, ignoring this law. And now we're surprised that all of these institutions are crashing around our ears. It's that airplane that can't fly because, oops, we forgot to take into account this critical law. And the other critical law is the law of love, that the whole earth and the universe are founded on the basis of the law of love, on the law of attraction, on the law of integration. So if we have this new understanding, what's step 4 of the alchemy of peace process? We adopt a new habit. And what is the habit that we need here to solve our global challenges? The habit is to build a United States of the world, or if you like, a world federal system. This is truly crucial. I'm going to offer an analogy again to demonstrate that this is the next logical step. A wonderful Singaporean diplomat by the name of Kishore Mahbubani likened the world to, he said, we used to be 193 boats. Each nation was a boat, bobbing on the sea of international life, and our main task was just not to bump into each other. He says, now we've evolved. We're no longer 193 separate boats. We're a single ship with 193 cabins. He said, while each cabin is really well run, so each nation is well run, or run at least, not necessarily well, there is no captain or crew to guide the ship as a whole. So we have no form of global governance or world government that can steer humanity in times of collective trouble. So the pandemic hit and there was nobody at the helm of the ship. There were no shared principles and values. There were no shared collective decision-making and enforcement institutions. There was not an institution to say, okay, we're going to start producing PPE for all nations, equitably distributed. Okay, we're going to start making sure that we have enough needles and so on and so forth. And we're going to start producing vaccines and ensuring that they're properly distributed. And these are going to be binding laws that every nation has to abide by. It's not voluntary. So you see what happens when our world has run without a captain or crew. You know, the historian, famous 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee predicted that humanity would arrive at a point where it was under existential threat, so the threat of destroying itself, before it formed some form of global government. And he said, we'll go towards it kicking and screaming. We won't want to, but we'll ultimately voluntarily do it because we realize it is the only way to solve our global problems. And I keep thinking about COVID. You know, we're nowhere near done with COVID. And as long as other countries and other nations, and including our own, don't get vaccinated, new forms of mutation are going to arise. And at some point, we're quite likely to get a form of COVID that is resistant to the vaccines we've had. And that puts us right back at square one. And then we got to start developing the vaccine all over again and start. So it's crazy. So we're going to be forced, I think, to learn this lesson. And while we're dealing with COVID, climate change is the barreling truck coming down the road, and we're standing right in its way. It's going to absolutely decimate us. We're already starting to see the effects with wildfires and droughts and famine, lack of water, even in the United States of America, fresh water is becoming scarce. So in the Southwest this year, many farmers and herders, they sold their cattle because they couldn't get water to give to these cattle. A large number of farmers let portions of their fields go fallow. So what happens? You have less land to grow on. Food becomes more expensive. Soil is eroded, coastlines are eroded because of floods. People move inward, we have to share land with each other. It leads to conflict, it leads to disease, it leads to shortages of food and water. I mean, we've got a nightmare ahead of us. And they say just by 2050, 140 million people will have been displaced just due to climate change. Where are these people going to go? And it's just going to get worse with time. So where to begin? What do we mean by United States of the world? I propose starting by creating a global legislature, a world parliament that is truly representative of the people of the world, that has democratic legitimacy, that is whose members are elected by members of each country. So each nation, just like we pick our members of Congress or parliament within our countries, we also get to elect our representatives to world parliament so that they truly represent us. They have to be given the power to legislate in certain narrow areas where humanity's collective interests are at stake, like climate change and the pandemic. The parliament should have all rights to make war. So all nations give up all their rights to make war. And the parliament only does it in order to protect humanity against countries that are going to destroy the peace. By the way, giving up rights to war will free up $2 trillion per year that countries spend on global armaments. Imagine if we could devote $2 trillion globally, we would be able to deal, we need 50 billion, whatever it is, 50 billion doses of the vaccine, $50 billion to deal with the vaccine to make sure everyone's vaccinated. Easy, 50 billion out of 2 trillion. And then that would leave us funds to deal with adaptation to climate change and provide homes for people who've been displaced. I mean, it's amazing what we can do. The parliament would have certain rights to taxation, and they would be the trustee of all the Earth's critical resources, like our energy resources, to make sure that everybody in every nation has equitable access to their energy needs, for example. We also need a world court to adjudicate disputes within countries so we don't then enter into wars over them. Again, the court has to be truly representative. And by the way, if you want more details on all of this, feel free to look at my video podcast, Reimagining Our World. I have a series on each of these. They're each of 20 minutes long, one on the world, on the World Parliament, on the World Court. And I unpack it further so you can really get a sense of what is proposed here. The court has to have compulsory jurisdiction. In other words, when nations start fighting, they don't get to choose whether to go to court or not. If you're a murderer accused of murder, you don't get to choose whether to go to court. But in our international system, you get to choose whether you show up in court or not, which is crazy. And then if the court passes judgment, there has to be a means of enforcing it. So just like a murderer who is then sentenced, found guilty of murder and sentenced, he or she can't walk themselves to the jail. Judge says, I trust you to lock yourself up for the next 20 years. No, we have an enforcement system. The marshal takes them down to the courts and down to the prison and locks them up. We don't have such a system at the international level, which is crazy. We need an international executive and standing force. That means an international executive is a body that makes sure that the laws that the World Parliament creates are actually enforced, and that the judgments that the World Court metes out are also actually enforced. And to back it up, it has an international standing force, a world, if you like, police force that ensures that countries abide by international rules. The deterrent value of having such a force is very high. Nations will think twice before they breach and violate international laws, and the international community can move quickly. So if Bashar al-Assad had known that there was an international standing army and that there was a world government that was willing to come after him if he used chemical weapons against his own people, he may have thought twice about doing it. Right now, these kinds of leaders and countries know that they can act with impunity and nobody's going to do anything to them, as demonstrated, in Syria, as demonstrated with Russia, annexing the Crimea, and nobody did anything about it functionally. Okay. The last comment I'll make, the last slide, is that the UN in its present form doesn't fit the bill. We can discuss this more later. The UN is not a world federation. It does not have the power to pass binding legislation. Its members, the UN General Assembly, are not elected. They do not really adequately represent the peoples of the world. The World Court that we have does not have compulsory jurisdiction. Its judges are not transparently elected. They're appointed in closed door backroom dealings. So the trust level is not high. We do not have an international standing force, and our Security Council is not a proper international executive. It has no power to enforce laws. First of all, there are no laws produced by the General Assembly for the Security Council to enforce. All it does is it issues resolutions, and it hopes to God that nations abide by it. And we see that nations don't. Iran has not abided by resolutions. You can go country after country after country. In Iraq, we went to war because Mr. Hussein did not abide by a whole series over a period of 13 years of Security Council resolutions, and so on and so forth. All right. For those of, oops, did you stop sharing my screen, Farinaz?
Oh, that wasn't me.
Okay, all right. Let me just go back for a sec here. For those of you who are interested in this material, feel free to look at The Alchemy of Peace. It's the book I wrote this year. It's available worldwide at Amazon. And I think you'll find it interesting. It unpacks some of this stuff more, but this is you just got a taste today of what it looks like to apply the Alchemy of Peace method. So you can take the methodology and apply it in any area, and it will yield results. And in the book, I've chosen 6 particular areas, and I unpack in detail. So I hope you found this interesting and helpful. I will now stop sharing my screen, and we can move to conversation and questions.
Thank you so much, dear Sovaida, for helping us explore this theme, how we can overcome the scourge of nationalism, xenophobia, tribalism, polarization, using this model. I am sure that people have questions. They are welcome to ask a question or make a comment. To do so, please raise your hand in the participant window or type your question in the chat box. To raise your hand, click on participants at the bottom of the screen. A window will open, and at the bottom you can click on raise hand. If typing a question in chat, please begin your question with a question mark, and then you can address your question to the entire group, or feel free to address it privately to me.
It's nice to see your faces. More faces are popping up. Hey, Payman.
I can start with a question.
All right, go ahead.
Or comment. So, for example, the European Union, which was a good try, or they've tried to kind of come together and build a union. And of course, the UK, unfortunately, was not able to sustain and stay in. And listening to an interview by some of the original collaborators who were putting the laws together, they said, we'll put in a law that countries can move away, but we'll just put it to kind of give a sense of security to them. They never thought that, such a thing would happen. That was, but it did happen. And so how do we, because I think there's such vast differences in material wealth of different countries, and all those isms, kick in, or phobias, and they say, oh, why should we spend our money on the less wealthy nations? And We hear that, well, in the United States, they're trying to find out the real reason behind why people migrate to the United States, and they go to the other countries, but at the same time, they're not really willing to spend the money and the time and the resources, which would be great, because they probably have not, until they get to the notion of all humanity is one and we're all should have the same value in all countries, not just because of where we live geographically. How do we get across, past that? Maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually quite delighted that you asked that question. That's such a great question. It's one that my students in a seminar I do always, it's one of their go-to questions, right? And it's perfect. So the EU, let's look at it. The EU was an amazing laboratory for one way to go about deepening integration. The person who founded the EU, he came up with, it was his brainchild, Jean Monnet, actually wanted Europe to become a United States of Europe. In other words, he wanted it to be a federation like the United States of America. Why? Because he was a Frenchman. He had lived in the US for a while in New York, and he had seen the power of this country, its economic power, its political power, etc., and military power. And he knew it was because its strength came from its unity. And he said, if we could only apply this in Europe, then we'd be golden. But he was smart enough to know that Europeans were not mentally prepared for it. So he started with this idea of the European coal and steel community. And basically, he said what he was hoping to do was start small and then build what he called links in a chain of ever increasing integration. But his goal from the start was to achieve federation. The reason I believe that the EU has failed, that Brexit happened, was precisely not because the EU integrated, but because it has not integrated fast enough, and therefore has been incapable of dealing with some violent tests that have come to it. The first violent test that it was confronted with was the global financial crisis, where because it didn't have a common monetary policy and it didn't have the ministers of the treasury, the finance ministers of the country, different countries did not have a cohesive approach to tackling that problem. They didn't have a Federal Reserve like we do in this country. They were not capable of dealing with that problem adequately. And so that weakened them. The second thing was when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. They found themselves completely powerless as a cohesive unit to resist. Third sign of weakness was when Syria happened and migrants started to flow in, and they realized they didn't have a common policy on refugees and migration. They didn't have a common way to police external borders. They didn't have a common policy for how to divide refugees and who would pay for them. See, if they had been a federation, if Europe had been a federation, all of these issues would have been dealt with. All these decisions would have been made collectively at the federal level. It was precisely because of the absence of a coherent and sensible policies and all these fronts that Britain left. And in fact, far beyond material resources for Britain were actually a minimal reason. It was really xenophobia. They didn't want people from other countries coming in. It was the migrant issue. So the United States, when we moved from a confederation of 13 states to a federation, people forget our history. We had much the same problems that Europe is having today. But we were smart and figured out that the only way not to fall apart, because there was a danger that even the 13 states the Confederation itself would weaken so much it would fall apart. We also had a debt crisis, just like Europe had a debt crisis. We also had a security crisis. Each state had its own army, and each state was aligned with a different country in Europe. So you could see the danger. Two countries in Europe, say France and England, go to war with each other. And then the states in the United States that are aligned with France go to war against the states in the United States that are aligned with Britain. So the whole unity of our system was subject to danger. And it was because we recognized all these dangers that we realized that our power and strength would come from deepening integration. Indeed, when members of the European Central Bank of Europe came to the US in 2011 to confer with members of the Treasury about help us, what do we do to get out of this? You know what the advice was? They handed them a copy of the Articles of Confederation of the US and the Constitution. They said, we had the same problem you did. Your problem is not a financial problem. It's not a money problem. You need to integrate and you need to think about moving towards a federation. Mind-blowing. 99 years, almost 100 years before that, that was exactly the advice Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the Prophet founder of the Baha'i faith and his first authorized interpreter, who traveled extensively in 1912 in the United States. That was the advice he gave to a high official in Washington, D.C., who had asked him, how can I best serve my country? And Abdu'l-Baha told him, if you want to serve your country and serve the world, export the principles of federalism on which your country's government is based to the rest of the world, because globally we need it. And then 99 years later, American officials are telling European officials, hey, guess what? The solution and answer to your problems is this. I find that fascinating, right? It was front page news in the International Herald Tribune in 2011, and like nobody commented on it. People didn't say, huh, what kind of advice are you giving? So that's, yeah. So I think the EU is a lab, and it has had some successes that we can learn from, and it has had some failures that we must also learn from at global level. And one of those failures is if you don't integrate rapidly enough and create the federation, if you do a half-baked job, it's like a human being becoming retarded. It's like the teenager waiting and acting out until they're in their 30s and 40s. You know, you're just late in your developmental stage, and it has consequences. So I don't know if that helps, but
thank you. That was excellent.
Question.
Appreciate it. It's failure to launch, unfortunately.
Failure to launch. There you go. You put it so simply.
Thank you so much for that question, Payman, and the response, Sovaida. There is a comment in the chat. I don't know if you're seeing it.
Yeah, David Thorpe. Yes, thank you. Yes, I'll read it out loud so everybody sees it. With all said and done, it seems to me that the root cause of all our problems is the lack of ethical, moral, and spiritual values, and that until the latter are much more prevalent, including our world leaders, there's little basis for progress. Anyway, your comments are appreciated. So yes and no is what I would say, David. Don't give up so easily. So you're absolutely right that the root cause of problems is ethical, moral, and spiritual values. And in fact, that guy Kishore Mahbubani, who gave that beautiful analogy, which I love, and I always give him credit for it, of the ship, right, with 193 cabins, he talks about the fact that each cabin has its own set of values, right? And what's problematic about that is that some of the values within some of the cabins are such that those values can scuttle the entire ship. So it's important that the captain and crew are at a point where we can agree on what is now called in prevalent discourse a shared set of global ethics. or shared set of principles. That's how I articulated it when I was writing about it starting in 2008. And then later, about 10 years later, 15 years later in the literature, I started to see people started talking about a set of global ethics. I was like, yeah, that's great. We're finally getting on board here. So yes, but we can't afford to wait until people are spiritualized. And this is very clear from the Baha'i writings. And this is what's fascinating to me. The whole concept of, so the Baha'i writings have this vision that humanity progresses through stages, just as an individual does. And that the next step that we're all working towards is something the Baha'is call lesser peace. The lesser peace is characterized by really certain institutional and legal changes. In fact, it is defined as creating a global order to which all nations will sign on before they're spiritualized, before morally and spiritually they have necessarily progressed, but literally because of dire need, because they'll realize there's no other way to tackle certain problems. And I'm convinced that climate change is going to be the thing, with the help of COVID, right, that gets us there, because there is no other way to solve climate change. So it's a very stark choice, do or die. We either kill ourselves or allow climate change to decimate a large segment of humanity, or we do something. And no one nation or two nations or five nations can solve climate change. It has to be everybody acting together. So this is the do or die moment. We've come to that fork in the road where it seems like our creator is kind of like fed up with us. And of course, we ourselves, because of our choices, have brought ourselves to this point. And now we get the opportunity to learn to create this international institutions, this global order in which all nations will have ceded a certain amount of sovereignty so that we can tackle global challenges. And it's backed by an ability to enforce these decisions that the global community makes. This is going to come before the world is spiritualized. Once we get to this process of the lesser peace, we will realize that there are a lot of problems we still cannot solve, right? We're still not going to love each other. The prejudices are still going to be there, particularly class prejudice, racial prejudice, some of these really deeply ingrained prejudices. And then we'll realize at some point as we bang our heads against the wall that it's not enough to have a global order and collective security. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And it will be, according to Baha'i belief, the first step. So the reason I'm being so adamant about this is that what I fear is that when we start to think, oh, we have to wait till everyone is spiritualized and morals are fixed, that we relax and we don't put in place a system of world government and collective security that's absolutely essential if we're to survive. Because if we're going to wait till we're spiritualized, we're going to be waiting past the extinction of a good segment of humanity. So first step is to put this order in place, do the best we can. And while we're doing it, of course, also work on raising moral values and spiritualizing and so on. And then we move to the spiritualization. And that, by the way, leads to the second kind of peace that the Baha'i writings talk about, which is the most great peace. And Abdu'l-Baha, again, the son of the Prophet founder, has a beautiful analogy to describe this. He says, the lesser peace is like having a beautiful body that is like a corpse. It has no life, but you need the body. Then when you breathe that, when the body is spiritualized, you breathe life into it, then it becomes a live body. But we need the body. The first step is the body. We got to do that first. So we can't relax vigilance and say, oh, let's just wait till we've done, for Baha'is, all our work with children's classes and junior youth. We have to do this. We have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. And in fact, the Shoghi Effendi, I'm going to hammer this home with one final comment. Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of the Baha'i faith and the second authorized interpreter, writing to a couple of individual Baha'is in the 1930s, it's almost 90 years ago, says to them that when you share about the Baha'i faith with friends, I want you to emphasize first, the need, the impending need for a world system of world government, a world federation. And then he says, and there's no reason why the Baha'is should not be at the forefront of this work. So again, we need to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, to me, those were marching orders from the Guardian. We failed to do them, right? But now we still have time, and the needs are great again. As I say, with climate change, it's an absolute necessity. So when we talk to people, to me, it's also a great way to help our friends realize, and for friends who are watching this, that the teachings of the Baha'i faith are entirely relevant to the needs of humanity today. We're not just another nice religion with a nice set of moral values and a slightly different way of saying our obligatory prayers and a slightly different way of fasting. We're not just another one. Baha'u'llah has brought the solutions to humanity's particular challenges today, challenges like COVID, challenges like climate change, challenges like the threat of nuclear holocaust. These are really critical. So anyway, that's why I feel so strongly about it, because I think we all need to be doing a lot more to help bring this about. But thank you very much for your comment. Samaya. Yeah, high schools and universities teach about wars. Isn't it time to introduce the consequences? Yes, of the terms you have discussed today, so that the new generation understands the roots of the divisions and hatred in the war. Yes, I mean, look, Samaya, thank you. This is why I wrote this book. It's really directed at young people and others, because we need to, once you uncover the drivers of what has gotten us here, once you uncover the mindsets that I said last time, I don't think you were here, but that these mindsets, these ways of thinking are like the operating system of a computer that act in the background. We're unaware of them. That's what makes them dangerous. My goal here is to bring to light what are the driving mindsets that have gotten us to this place that we don't like, and what are the habits that resulted from those ways of thinking. And then, okay, now that I realize that's there, I can choose, exercise free will choice and say, I don't like the result here, so I'm gonna remove this mindset, and now what can I replace it with? You always have to have a replacement. So then we have the replacement mindset, which was the Oneness Model, the single organism, the law of oneness, and the law of love. But behind it an explanation, and then from this, the habit that naturally flows, if we understand we're interconnected, is the need for a system of world government. So I hope that makes sense, and I agree with you. It's critical. So thank you. I can't hear you, Sumaya, if you're talking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yay.
okay. I just retired. I've been teaching for over 20 years. And I think teachers are responsible for a lot of things that they can share with the students. And the idea of loving the kid sitting next to you, no matter what religion or race or language they speak. I taught ESL. My kids came from different parts of the world. And I wonder if ever there will be a book about some of the values, Baha'i values, that come out of the social studies or whatever, because parents these days have no time to teach what we're trying as Baha'is to teach in our homes. Everybody is busy. So for these young kids to become young adults and responsible in this world government, they need to have some kind of basis, not to wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to be nice or I'm going to do something. It grows on you. You just... one of my sons is married to a Jamaican, the other one is lady from El Salvador. I married an American. Our house is more like international. So some of the values should be integrated in these children. This has always been my thought. Thank you for your wonderful lecture.
I don't, not at all. Sumaya, I don't know if this will be helpful to you, but precisely with a view to doing this and precisely with the view to doing it for young people, so ages really 14 upwards. In 2015, I wrote a small book called Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. And a good segment of it is specifically that, articulating a set of global ethics. What are the principles? And then showing how the effect. So we need to build institutions, but we need to weave those principles into those institutions, right? You can't have the institutions devoid of the principles. So it's small. It's been very popular amongst young people. So if you have friends who are teachers in school, feel free to share it with them. I've put it at the name in the chat, Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving a Global Crisis. It's easy to read. It would take a young person maybe 40 minutes to read it. So, and it's easy to understand. And it also demonstrates very tangibly to them how applying these principles in institutions actually helps resolve real problems in the world, which is what makes it interesting. It's not theory, right? Because if you just throw a bunch of principles at young people, their eyes get glazed over because it's all theory. But if you can show and practice why it impacts their lives, then it becomes interesting to them. So.
Thank you so much, Sumaya, and all of the dear participants with your questions and being present. Dear Sovaida, thank you so much for helping us explore these mindsets at the international level to help us understand how federalism can be a solution and how we as individuals have a responsibility to really apply principle to solving our global and closer at home problems. Thank you everyone for attending. Yeah, there will be a little bit of time after the recording ends if you'd like to stay on and continue with this conversation. The speaker next week will also be Ms. Sovaida Ewing, and she'll be speaking on whether the ends justify the means or should the means be as worthy as the ends. It'll be at the same Zoom link, and please invite your family, your friends, total strangers. We will now end with a closing prayer.
Can I just hop in before the closing prayer? Next week's session is, that's the mindset about the ends and means, but the habit we're looking at is electing fit leaders. How do we get ourselves from electing unfit leaders and unworthy leaders to electing fit leaders? So if you're interested in that topic, then you'll be interested in next week's session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems like we're running into some kind of technical difficulty.
Maybe we can just pull out a prayer book and.
I can also share my screen if it helps.
God, oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants and reveal to them thy great purpose. May they follow thy commandments and abide in thy law. Help them, O God, in their endeavor, and grant them strength to serve. Of thy knowledge and cheer their hearts and cheer